Okay, so this is really the last sort of concept I want to cover in talking about mapping or diagramming arguments, and it's this idea of objections. Once we have this, then I think we have everything we need to diagram even fairly complex arguments. Now, we might have to do some work applying the concepts. Arguments can get complicated, but this is really the last new thing. So why do we talk about objections? What are objections? Well, a lot of times some people are having a dialogue. One person might make an argument and the other person will present some kind of objection to it, right? Here's an example. So this guy David says, well, we can see drug laws don't work from the fact that prohibition failed. If they worked, then prohibition would have cut alcohol use. We all know that it didn't. David, I'm just taking this from this guy David Boaz. This is one of the arguments he makes for drug legalization. So I'll just say David here. I've never talked to this guy, but if I were to talk to him, this would be one of the things I would say. This isn't so clear to me. For one thing, hospital admissions for alcohol psychosis fell at the beginning of prohibition, as did deaths by cirrhosis. Even if prohibition didn't work, we couldn't generalize from that. Alcohol is culturally accepted in other ways, drugs aren't. Hey, look, if we were having a full argument, I would say more, but I'm just giving you guys sort of condensed toy examples to make a point. So here's David, Boaz's argument simplified, put into, distilled, put into this premise conclusion form. If laws restricting drug use worked, prohibition would have led to a decline in alcohol use. Prohibition did not lead to a decline in alcohol use, so laws restricting drug use do not work. My two objections, right? One, rates for admission for alcohol psychosis fell, as did deaths from cirrhosis. Alcohol has a special place in our culture, so you can't generalize to other drugs. So let's start how we would diagram this argument, right? So first off, we have if laws restricting drug abuse worked, prohibition would have led to a decline in alcohol use. Prohibition did not lead to a decline in alcohol use. Are these premises, do they offer independent or conjoint support? Well, conjoint, right? We'll talk a lot more about this when we get to formal logic, but we have an if-then statement. If A, then B. Then we have this other statement that says, well, not B, so not A. We will talk a lot more about this form of argument, modus tollens it's called, when we get to formal logic. But the idea is, if you say if A, then B, well, if B doesn't happen, A didn't either, right? So pretty good sign when you see an either or an if then, it's going to involve conjoint support. Just keep that in mind. So we can put our 1 and 2 here. We will draw it like this, right? 1, 2. One and 2 work together to support 3. All very basic, all things we've seen before, right? But now how do we map our objections? Well, we need to think about what they're objections to, right? Rates of admission for alcohol psychosis fell, as did deaths from cirrhosis. Well, if alcohol psychosis admissions fell, that seems to indicate alcohol abuses probably went down. Deaths from cirrhosis, if you look this up, mainly a result of alcohol abuse. Might be the only thing that causes it commonly. I don't know. Look it up, but it's the main thing, right? If deaths from cirrhosis go down, pretty good indication alcohol abuses went down. So objection 1 seems to be an objection to premise 2. Objection 2, on the other hand, says, well, alcohol has a special place, so you can't generalize from alcohol to other drugs. Well, that seems an objection to number 1, right? It's saying, well, if alcohol restrictions don't work, drug restrictions generally don't work. This is saying, whoa, 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 alcohol's different. You can't make that sort of assumption. So objection 2 is an objection to premise 1. So how do we map those? Well, Lavin has a pretty good method for this, and it's also, pretty simple. So, right, I said objection 1 is an objection to premise 2. So we just draw a little bubble here, a little thing that says, sorry, my writing's terrible, objection 1. And we show which premise it's an objection to, or what it's an objection to, and that's premise 2. Draw this little line through it so we know what it indicates. Objection 2 is an objection to premise 1. So we draw a little line to it, draw a line through it to indicate it. We can see now we've diagrammed this argument. Now, a lot of times when you see objections, there'll be an argument between people. But sometimes, well, actually, let me give you guys another example, right? Here is a very simple argument. Dale says vaccines have been shown to cause autism, so they're dangerous, so no one should vaccinate their children, right? Peggy says, well, the only study that shows that I know of was fake. It was this British doctor who cooked up evidence. Plus, diseases like measles are very dangerous, so it wouldn't follow that we should not vaccinate our children, even if vaccines did pose some dangers. One must weigh the risks. So Dale's argument's pretty simple, right? They cause autism, so they're dangerous. The fact they're dangerous shows we shouldn't give them to children. Dale's argument can be mapped like this because it has a very simple structure. It just looks like premise 1 supports premise 2, which supports the conclusion number 3, right? 1, 2, 3. About as simple an argument structure as you could ever hope to see, right? I guess 1 to 2 would be simpler, but this is very simple. But now let's look at Peggy's objections, right? She objects Objection 1, the only study that shows they cause autism was fabricated. That's an objection against premise 1. Let me reword this. Even if they were dangerous, the diseases they prevent may be more dangerous. So objection 1 is pretty clearly an objection against this premise 1, that they've been shown to do this. But objection 2 is a little harder, right? It doesn't seem like it challenges any of the premises. It doesn't deny that they're dangerous, even though Peggy doesn't believe this. Doesn't deny they cause autism. What it denies is this move from premise 2 to premise 3. This is another way that an objection might work. It's not saying that any of the premises are false. It's saying the inference from one premise to another or a premise to the conclusion isn't a good one. So how would we diagram these objections? Objection 1 is an objection against premise 1. Objection 2 is an objection from the move from 2 to 3. So let's see how that would look. All right, sorry, so objection 1 an objection against premise one. Draw our arrow, put a line through it. Now objection two, not an objection to any particular premise, but instead an objection to the inference. So we draw our line pointing at the inference from 2 to 3, not objecting to a premise, objecting to the move from this premise to the conclusion. Now, those are really the most common, and that's what you're going to have to sort out. Does the objection challenge a premise or a move from one premise to another, or from the premises to a conclusion? An inference, as Lavin puts it. But I think Lavin's a little too restrictive, right? Because sometimes objections might just directly challenge the conclusion itself. Now, here's an example. I stole this from this blogger, this guy, Freddie DeBoer. He's often pretty unpleasant, but I don't know. He's pretty good writing about Star Trek or Star Wars. When he writes about how other people aren't nice enough to him, even though he's very mean to other people, I have to laugh. But on Star Wars, he's not bad, right? So this is a version of his argument that I lifted and simplified. Yes, Luke Skywalker defeated Vader and blew up the Death Star, but he was never an all-conquering badass. If you guys have seen the Star Wars movies, whatever, this will make sense. If it doesn't, just, follow along. Note how much he whined in the first film. He also kept wanting to give up during his training. He failed the first test Yoda gave him. He got beaten badly by Vader during their first encounter. Now look, he whined a lot, wanted to give up, failed the first test Yoda gave him. Vader beat him badly in the first encounter. What kind of support did these have for the conclusion? These are all independent support, right? So if I were going to diagram this, of course, this argument would look like this. So, I'll give you guys just another page here. And, 1, 2, 3, 4, all. Each of these gives some reason to think, well, Luke was never this badass character, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, all give you some reason to accept 5. But now if you think about the objections, none of them seem like an objection to a premise, right? He beat Vader. I mean, maybe you could argue, that that's an objection to 4, but it doesn't really look like it, right? Vader beat him bad in the first encounter. He eventually beat him. The objection's not denying 4, right? I mean, I guess if you really wanted to stretch it, you could say it's denying the inference from 4 to the conclusion. That really doesn't seem the best place to put it to me. Objection 2, he blew up the Death Star. I don't know where in the world that would go for any of these. Seems to me the best place for one, arguably one, I think one here too. One is against the conclusion and definitely 2, right? So in the case where the objection is just an objection to the conclusion itself, I would just put it there, even though Lavin doesn't talk about that, and I think that would look something like this. Sorry, it's taking a minute to load up here. So just objection 1, objection 2. Both of these are just objections to the conclusion itself, right? They give you some reason to think he is in fact a badass. Person making this argument thinks that there's more reason to think he isn't. So there's the objections. Now look, a lot of times, you might want to map objections because People are arguing, one person argues for a claim, the other person denies it. But I think this argument gives us another reason that we want to map objections, which is just that a lot of times when people are arguing, they will note possible objections to their position. And, I think people do this, and I think this is good writing because we want to know what there's the most reason to believe. And you should be fair with your reader. If you think, well, here's a reason you might not believe this, be open about it. Don't try to hide it. And when people do this, we want to be able to diagram it. In really advanced things, people will give objections and then they'll give ways of meeting the objections. You know, that might get super complicated. None of the arguments we're going to look at do that. In that case, if you did have an argument like that, it might look, give you guys an example. You know, if someone, well, if someone, wanted to say, well, Luke only beat Vader by embracing the dark side, which he did, that might be an objection to objection one. You know, people will call these counters. You might even draw that in there, right? We're not going to see much of this because you can already see, even if my handwriting weren't a disaster, this gets to be really messy. But, that's how we would put that in there if we wanted to do it. All right, so hopefully that makes sense to you guys. I'll give you guys one more example in the next lecture. I'll give you guys a more complicated argument. We'll diagram it, map it, see how this might really work. All right.